The title of most underrated Call of Duty is one that has gotten thrown around a lot over the years within the Call of Duty fandom. But in my mind, the only game in the series that truly deserves that title is Call of Duty World at War. The successor to my beloved Call of Duty 4, World at War took the foundation of COD 4, tweaked it to better fit the World War II setting with their own little twists and turns to make it a unique Call of Duty experience. And we can't forget about the zombies. As we all know, World at War introduced this incredibly popular game mode that breathed new life into the series, and quite frankly was and still is the reason many people played World at War. But something that many people don't really talk about is the handful of ports and spin-offs that World at War received. Yes, we know that World at War released on PS3, 360, and PC, but there were 4 other versions of this game that many people glossed over or simply didn't seem to remember at all. Now here's an obvious one. World at War on the Wii. I don't think it's worth zeroing in on this particular version of the game too hard because for the most part it's just World at War but on Wii. However, there are some significant differences that make it more of a unique experience, we'll say. Let's start with some of the obvious ones. The graphical fidelity is significantly diminished due to the hardware restrictions of the Wii. HD is simply not even an option with this version because at the most, the Wii could output to like 480i, 480p, which is a feature all in itself if you ask me. Additionally, the game could only run at 30 FPS, and when playing the multiplayer, the maximum player count is lowered from 12 down to 10. And speaking of the multiplayer, there was no voice chat in this game at all, and no DLC was released on the Wii, so the 8 maps that the game launched with was what you got. Sadly, any of the maps that had tanks in them, such as CeeLo, were removed from the game entirely. Rather than just, removing the tanks from the maps and downsizing the maps where necessary, they just got cut altogether. For lots of players like myself, being a young teen who were lucky to get a Call of Duty at all, playing only the base maps is pretty standard, but the fact that there were only 8 of them is a bit disappointing. There were also a slew of other absences such as perk removals, equipment like flares were removed, and even the ability to hold your breath when sniping is not in the game. You can't use the Wii Classic controller for this game, so motion controls are required, which makes this like a whole new beast to tame. It's kind of like a light gun game almost. And finally, Zombies mode, it just isn't here at all. But other than those omissions, the game, it's all here. The PS2 was no stranger to Call of Duty games, from Finest Hour to the mainline series like Call of Duty 3, but not many talk about the fact that the PS2 was home to an exclusive title that you could only play right here on the PlayStation 2. World at War Final Fronts is a spin-off title from the mainline Call of Duty World at War. It's a rather peculiar title as it was a very late release into the PS2's life cycle, coming to the console in November of 2008. As I stated before, it was a PS2 exclusive and was released on the exact same day that the mainline World at War came to PS3, 360, Wii, etc. And it was an alternative for those who did not have the chance to move up to the then current console generation. Unlike the mainline World at War, Final Fronts was not developed by Treyarch, but was outsourced to Rebellion Developments, whom you may know from their quite popular third-person tactical stealth shooter series Sniper Elite. Now, despite the cover of the game looking almost identical to the mainline World at War, Final Fronts shares almost nothing in common with the main game. It has a completely unique story, runs on a different engine, and is an all-around unique experience. The story takes place over 3 chapters and focuses on 3 different locales and major areas of conflict during the final days of World War II: the Pacific, the Battle of the Bulge, and Rhine Crossing. I personally quite like the change of focus for the story in this game because it doesn't feel like a port, and that's simply because it isn't. Unfortunately, the caveat of it being a spin-off handled by a different team on a different engine means that it doesn't really feel or play much like a Call of Duty game would, at least not to me. The Asura engine Final Fronts runs on makes it feel much more arcadey than the mainline games, and the rather linear game design solidifies that arcadey feeling. I can't say this is an overall negative for the game because Call of Duty in itself is not an overly realistic game, but I figure I put that out there because it makes an already arcadey franchise feel even more PS2. Now, if that's your thing, look no further. Final Fronts is not a premier Call of Duty experience, but it is a different one, and I have to give it credit for that. One area of this game that carries over from the main game almost perfectly is that horrifying darkness and reality that World at War depicts so perfectly.
I joined up, rather than wait to be drafted. I figured if I was gonna have to fight, it would be better fighting alongside the best there was.
From the eerie cutscenes to the haunting music, they completely nailed the horrors of war that World at War did so well with the main game. Final Fronts is by no means a must-play title, but if you've ever had a itch for a good enough World War II shooter experience on the PS2 that balances nostalgic graphics and mostly modern gameplay, then this might be the game for you. Just in general, I also greatly appreciate the fact that the PS2 got its own unique Call of Duty experiences like this one instead that made the games actually worth playing or at least trying out. They could have just given us some shoddy port like the Wii instead. You ever thought to yourself, boy, I really wish I could play Call of Duty on the go? Well, me too. But have you ever thought, boy, I wish I could play Call of Duty on the go, but with a stylus? Yeah, me neither. But what I have thought about is the unlikely combination of one of my favorite video game franchises with one of my favorite handheld consoles. Call of Duty World at War on the Nintendo DS was developed by N-Space, who previously developed Modern Warfare for the DS, and they would go on to develop basically all the Call of Duty games on the DS going forward. Much like Final Fronts, this game has a 3-chapter structure and a completely unique campaign and multiplayer experience. Yes, it's true. Unlike the PS2 version, World at War DS did have online multiplayer with completely original maps. I'm no video game reviewer, but I will say that this game truly shocked me. I thought for sure that the control scheme and aiming with the stylus in particular would be very gimmicky and just bad, but it actually kind of wasn't. You get a lot of precision with the stylus that honestly just kind of shocked me how natural it felt. It's almost like playing the game with a mouse in a way. However, the controls weren't all great. As you'd expect, movement is tied to the D-pad, and in this case, you fire your weapon with the left trigger. Or if you're a lefty, you can move with ABXY and shoot with the right trigger. Where movement starts to feel a little bit unnatural is when you need to vault, reload, or interact with any of the things on the maps. It requires you to take your hands off the wheel in one way or another. You either need to cease aiming and use that same hand to click on one of the on-screen buttons, or you need to take your finger off the D-pad in order to reach over and press those same buttons. Now, my biggest complaint with this game is that for people like me, aka adult males who have reasonably large mitts, I get massive hand cramps when playing for longer than like 10 minutes. That is obviously less of a gripe with the game and more just the compact form factor of the DS Lite for a guy like me, but it's not a problem I have with playing most other games on the DS. However, if you were interested in trying this game out, I figured it might be worth mentioning, just in case. Short game sessions were pretty much mandatory for me, or you can just play on a larger DS like the DSi XL or 3DS XL. If you do choose to play on the 3DS, I will say having the analog stick does make movement feel much more natural, and I definitely recommend it over playing on an original DS or DS Lite. But even with the hand cramps and sometimes janky controls, it's not a horrible system when it comes to controlling your character, but it can be a bit finicky sometimes, especially when you're dealing with a lot of enemies at one time. Additionally, running and crouching are tied to the D-pad via a double tap. You double tap and then hold forward and you start sprinting, which works pretty well, but weirdly enough, the double tap down to crouch didn't seem to work quite as smoothly. I'd often have to do that sequence a couple of times in order to actually crouch. Now, regarding performance, you're not going to get a nice buttery smooth 60 FPS here on the DS. Most of the time it's a pretty solid 30, but does often dip down when there are a lot of enemies or explosions on screen. However, as this is a fully 3D first-person shooter on the DS, the hardware is already being pushed to its absolute limit, so you won't find yourself fighting dozens of enemies at one time. It's more like 5 or 6 at most, as anything more than that, I'm sure the DS would probably catch fire or something. Surprisingly, the DS version feels closer to the main release of the game when it comes to the features, seeing as it did have a campaign and multiplayer, unlike the PS2 version, but is still very far from truly feeling like the mainline World at War on the go. Overall, World at War DS is quite impressive, all things considered, and genuinely quite decent to play. I had a lot of fun messing around with this game and was pretty impressed with how playable the game really was. If you were one of the unlucky few who didn't have access to the mainline World at War but really wanted to play zombies, well, you couldn't. At least not at launch, but 1 year later, Call of Duty World at War Zombies would come to the iOS App Store. Yes, that's right, zombies on your phone. What else could you ask for? Released on November 16, 2009, and developed by Ideaworks in combination with Treyarch, you had a zombies-only experience on your iPhone. Now, sadly, this game has since been shut down, and although there may be some questionable ways to still obtain this game online, I don't have an iPhone, so I don't have any hands-on experience with the game. That being said, I've played plenty of FPS games using touch controls, and they are all kind of the same. I'm not a gamer that enjoys touch controls even a bit, but your mileage may vary. If you enjoy or tolerate touch controls, you probably wouldn't have much of a problem with this particular title. But enough about that. Let's talk about the game itself. Originally costing $9.99 for one map. Yeah, for Activision, that sounds about right. Nocturne Toten was the base map, and you could pay $5 each for Shinonuma and Doris, but cost aside, it actually received pretty decent reviews overall. This game also had a bit of a convoluted and confusing evolution. It started out as World at War Call of Duty Zombies. Based on my research, there were like different variations depending on the platform, but even aside from that, World at War Zombies offered a rather complete Zombies experience at the time. It wasn't without its jank and compromises, much like the other previous games I had mentioned, but that just comes with any mobile port experience. But for those who loved the Zombies mode and wanted to play it on the go, this was not only your best option, but your only one. And there you have it. Thanks for taking the time to look at some of the strange World at War ports and spin-offs. Hey, Editor Buggy here, just chiming in real quick because I did actually find that there is a 5th version of World at War, but I couldn't really find that much concrete evidence that this version truly existed. Conspiracy theories, woohoo. Anyway, this is basically all that I have. It's on Wikipedia, which we all know is highly reliable. There was allegedly a Windows mobile phone version as well. I'll read you the description here. Call of Duty World at War was released for the Windows Phone, Windows Mobile. However, the game features a run-and-gun genre similar to Commando from Capcom rather than a first-person shooter, a different storyline, and a different set of characters. The game was developed by Glue Mobile and published by Activision. So apparently there was also a Windows Mobile version of this game, but I couldn't find any footage of this game existing online, at least not easily. So if you happen to know anything else about this version, definitely leave some information down in the comment section below. I'm highly interested to see what this game actually was like. So there you go. Call of Duty really used to do it all, meeting players on whatever platform they had and at a relatively decent level of quality too. Pretty much none of these games were great, but they were fun for what they were. I definitely recommend giving any of these games a try, as they really are quite the unique experience for each of these platforms and can often be found very much so on the cheap.